When I have some action in mind, I can have inclination for the object that I would bring about, but never respect precisely because it is merely the effect and not the activity of a will. Likewise, I cannot have respect for inclination as such, whether it is mine or someone else's at most. When it is mine, I can approve of it. When it is someone else's, I can sometimes love it myself as favorable to my own advantage. Only that which is connected to my will merely as a ground, never as an effect, which does not serve my inclination, but outweighs it, or at least excludes it entirely from calculations when we make a choice, and hence the mere law by itself. Only this can be an object of respect and hence a command. An action done from duty must entirely set aside the influence of inclination, and with it every object of the will. Thus, nothing remains that pure respect for this practical law, and hence the maxim of complying with such a law, even to the detriment of all my inclinations. Thus, the moral worth of an action lies neither in the effect that is expected from it, nor therefore in a principle of action that needs to borrow its motive from this expected effect. For all these effects, such as one's own comforts, or even the advancement of the happiness of others, could have been brought about in other ways. So, to achieve them, the will of a rational being is not required, but nevertheless, in this will, and in it alone, can the highest and an unconditional good be found. Therefore, preeminent good that we call moral can consist in nothing other than the representation of the law in itself, which obviously only occurs in the rational being, insofar as this representation, and not the hoped for effect, is the motive of the will. This good is already present in the person who acts according to this representation. It need not wait upon the effect of their action. Heavy footnotes. But what kind of law can this possibly be, where for the will to be called good absolutely and without qualification, representation of the law must determine the will regardless of the expected result? Since I have robbed the will of every impetus that could arise for it from following some particular law, the only thing remaining that could serve the will as its principle is the universal conformity of actions to law as such. That is, I ought never to proceed except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim become a universal law. Mm. Here then, what serves the will as its principle is mere conformity with law as such, without any law concerning particular actions serving as its ground. And this must be the case if duty is not to be an empty delusion and a chimerical conception. In making its practical judgments, common human reason actually agrees with this principle and has it constantly in view. For example, the question might be this: may I, when hard pressed, make a promise with the intention of not keeping it? Here it is easy for me to distinguish the different meanings the question can have. Whether to make a false promise is prudent, whether it accords with duty. Making a false promise can, no doubt, often be prudent. Of course, I can see perfectly well that this subterfuge might not get me out of my tricky situation, as in addition, I should think carefully about whether this lie not give me greater trouble later on. Thus, one might act more prudently in this matter by proceeding according to a universal maxim, by making it one's habit to promise nothing except when one intends to keep it. For the consequences of all my supposed cunning are not easy to foresee, and once trust in me is lost, this may be worse than the evil that I may mean to avoid. Only it soon becomes clear to me that a maxim of this sort will still be based on fear of the consequences. However, to be truthful from duty is quite different from being truthful from fear of adverse consequences. In the former case, the concept of the action in itself already contains a law for me, whereas in the latter, I must first look around elsewhere to see how things are likely to turn out for me. Even though deserting my maxim of prudence can sometimes be very advantageous to me, though adhering to it is, of course, safer, it is consequently wicked to deviate from the principle of duty. If I seek the quickest, accurate way of answering the question whether a lying promise conforms with duty, then I ask myself, would I really be content that my maxim, namely, of getting myself out of my tricky situation by means of a lying promise, should hold as a universal law for myself as well as others? And would I be able to say to myself, everyone may be making a lying promise if they find themselves in a situation they can get out of in no other way? I then immediately see that while I can will the lie, I cannot will a universal law to lie. For if there were such a law, there would actually be no promise at all. It would be futile for me to declare my future intentions to those who would not believe me, or if they were rash enough to do so, would pay back in the same way. Hence, my maxim, as soon as it were made a universal law, would necessarily destroy itself. Thus, I do not need any penetrating or astute knowledge to see how to make my willing morally good. Inexperienced in the way of the world, and unprepared for whatever lies in store, I only ask myself, can you will that your maxim become universal law? If not, then it is to be discarded, not because of the prospect of some cost to you or others, but because it cannot serve as a principle in any possible universal law giving for which reason compels immediate respect. And even if I have not yet fathomed its grounds, something the philosopher may investigate, I at least understand this much. It involves the apprehension of a worth that far outweighs anything extolled by inclination, and that what constitutes duty is the necessity of my actions from pure respect for the practical law to which, as the condition of a will good in itself, the worth of which surpasses everything else, any other motivation ground must give way. Thus, we have now reached the principle of the moral knowledge of common human reason, which it admittedly does not think of in the universal form into which we have distilled it, but does always have before its eyes and uses as a standard for judging. It would be easy to show how common human reason, with its compass in its hand, knows very well how to distinguish in any case that arises what is from that arises that arises what oh, in any case that arises what is good from what is evil, what conforms to duty or is contrary to it. Without attempting to teach it anything new, reason just has to be made to attend to its own principle, as it was by Socrates. Thus, neither science nor philosophy is needed to know what one has to do in order to be honest and good, indeed, even to be wise and virtuous. It should have been obvious all along that the knowledge of what all human beings are under an obligation to do and know is the business of everyone, even the commonest. In this respect, one cannot help but admire the great advantage that in the human understanding the capacity for practical judgment has over its theoretical counterpart. In the latter, when common reason dares to depart from the laws of experience and the perceptions of the senses, it falls into sheer incomprehensibility or internal contradiction, or at least into a chaos of uncertainty, obscurity, and vacillation. But in practical terms, it is precisely when common understanding excludes all sensuous drives from practical laws that the power of judging first begins to show itself to advantage. The common understanding then even acquires a certain sophistication, perhaps in quibbling with its conscience, with other claims about what is right or intended, or instead trying honestly to determine the worth of actions for its own instruction. The crucial thing is that when it does try honestly, common understanding is just as likely as any philosopher to hit the mark. Indeed, the common understanding is almost more likely to do so than the philosopher, because the latter must operate with the same principles as the former, but the philosopher can easily confuse their judgment with a host of alien and irrelevant considerations and be so deflected from the right path. As a result, would it not be wiser to leave moral matters to the judgment of common reason and just call in philosophy, present morals in a more systematic and graspable form, and make its rules easier to apply and also to debate? But when it comes to practical matters, prevent history from putting common human reason on a new path of investigation and instruction and leading it away from its fortunate simplicity. Innocence is a wonderful thing. Sadly, it is so hard to preserve and so easy to seduce. Because of this, even wisdom, which otherwise is more a matter of conduct than of reflective knowing, still needs rational inquiry too, not in order to learn from it, but in order to make sure that wisdom prescribes its effective and that what wisdom prescribes is effective and enduring. From their needs and inclinations, the entire satisfaction of which they sum up under the name of happiness, human beings feel within themselves a power counterweight to all those commands of duty that reason represents so demanding of the highest respect. Now, reason issues its commands unrelentingly, yet without promising anything to the inclinations, and hence, as it were, disrespecting and disregarding those claims which are so impetuous and yet which seem so reasonable and are not willing to be suppressed by any command. But from these, there arises a natural dialectic, namely, a propensity to rationalize against those strict laws of duty, to cast doubt on their validity, or at least their purity and strictness, and where possible, to make them more amenable to our wishes and inclinations. This is to fundamentally corrupt these laws and to deprive them of all their dignity, something that even common practical reason cannot ultimately endorse. As a result, common human reason is compelled to leave its sphere, not by some idle speculative need, the like of which never troubles it long enough as it is content to be mere sound reason, but rather on practical grounds. It then steps into the field of practical philosophy in order to gain information and instruction about the source and correct determination of its principle, in opposition to maxims based on need and inclination. In this way, it may escape from the predicament of competing claims and not run the risk of being deprived of all genuine moral principles because of the equivocation into which it easily falls. Thus, even practical common reason, when cultivated, inadvertently gives rise to a dialectic requiring it to seek for help from philosophy, just as it does in its theoretical use. The one will find as little peace as the other except through a complete critique of pure reason.